Welcome back to another episode of Church is Stupid.
Comma butt.
And today we finally, after 2 weeks of break, have someone back with us because he thought he could do other things.
I was busy, for both weeks. So, what's up? It's Elijah. I'm back.
You have minimal excuses.
There really was none. But here with us today, we have myself, Ruth.
Hi, everybody. I am Andy.
Yeah, and again, hello. I'm back, Elijah.
You know,
My name's Elijah, and I'm back.
At a certain point, when we introduced ourselves, you were competing with me to see, if you would ever win. And I don't think you've won.
I literally don't know what you're talking about right now.
Well, today in particular, you haven't won. That's...
The important thing is you lose, I think.
All right, sweet.
That's my real takeaway.
You can't claim victory today.
I don't know what I'm losing over, so.
Apparently the Super Bowl?
Yeah,
Oh,
fair
yeah,
enough.
the Super Bowl with the...
Hey, my team didn't even make it to the Super Bowl.
I'll be honest. The extent of what I knew about it is that I had a bet placed in the Super Bowl with girlfriend, significant other person. We can talk about it later. And my team got destroyed, and I blame them for not paying the refs yet. Like, their checks hadn't cleared at that point.
Oh, that's the worst.
Because, oh boy, there were a lot of bad calls in my book, and so I stopped watching it about halftime, and then it got worse. So, speaking about making bad calls.
Yes. So part of the really bad transition that happened right there.
That was a phenomenal
actually,
transition.
It was quite well done.
Speaking of yellow flags.
This week we're going to be delving more into some of the reasons why people leave the church and why people have chosen not to stay, or how they've been hurt. And in my quest for discovering what are some of the top reasons that people don't want to come to church anymore, I found one that I actually found rather surprising when I initially read it, but once I saw it, it made total sense. And one of the top reasons that people don't go to church is because they don't trust pastors. And as a pastor, I guess maybe I was just blinded to it because I want to think I'm awesome. No comments from either of you.
Continue.
But it was kind of surprising to me just to read that, especially, I don't know. I guess my dad was a pastor and I always trusted him. So it was hard for me to think in that world of a pastor being somebody who you don't trust. But then I think I've also always separated like bad pastors from what I would consider, quote, normal pastors in my head. And so the bad category has always been kind of subjugated in the smaller one, as opposed to like what I would consider a, quote, normal pastor, like my dad, or hopefully I might not attribute normal to myself, but close enough. And so I was just a little bit shocked. What about you guys? Were you shocked to see that was on the list of why people don't come to church?
In all honesty, no. And I can expound on that, but I'm interested to hear, Elijah, if that's surprising to you.
I don't think it was a little surprising, just because it's not something that I normally think about and not something that I had experiences with. It just, I don't know. I guess coming from church and then, like going to Christian college for like 1 year and seeing things that I liked and didn't like. There were a lot of other criticisms that I had with some of the church that normally didn't fall necessarily just on pastors, but on like a lot of other things. So to see that as like a main reason why some people didn't want to go, it surprised me at first, but then after like listening and reading a little bit more, I mean, it makes sense. A lot of the reasons connect because I've seen examples of it before. The more I really read about it, I guess.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I know that in particular, my reaction was not first to this idea of not trusted pastors, but to what you originally texted me of bad pastors. Which,
Yeah.
and I'll be fair, like that may not be the full topic, but like I think that's another interesting part to dive into, because there's this idea that when, like in the United Methodist Church in particular, we have every so often your pastors are going to get switched out because they serve a certain position on a certain charge. I don't know the technical words for it
We
all.
are appointed,
Mhm.
and so we are in
You serve a
itinerant.
specific- Yeah, okay.
We are in itinerant positions.
Okay. Yeah. But when one pastor gets transferred out of a church or a new pastor gets transferred in, what'll happen far more often than not is that half your congregation will leave. And I guess maybe not far more often than not, but it has been seen. And like in my experience, I've seen a few examples of this where the congregation will be extremely attached to one of the pastors, most likely in this case, the older pastor. And when that pastor leaves, they have the same expectations for the new pastor that they had for the old pastor. And so when you go from, I guess this is a very specific case, but what comes to mind is this like older gentleman pastor. They have a very specific way of preaching. And this is not to say that all of them do, but they're very somber, and you get a lot out of a lesson from them, or like this kind of thing. And you get set into this, okay, I really like my pastor. He is the go-to person for all spiritual things. And then you get told that your pastor is getting transferred out. And like people don't often understand fully why this whole transfer thing happens. And there's a lot of rules in the United Methodist Church about like a pastor isn't supposed to go back after they've left a charge, or like all of these different rules. But I think that that's where I came from more when I was thinking about bad pastors, is that sometimes it's not always the pastor's fault that they get blamed for being a bad pastor. It's that new pastor who doesn't preach exactly the same way as your old pastor does, or different things like that. And I guess I'm playing devil's advocate in the way of saying, give the person a chance before you judge them fully.
No, absolutely. Well, and it's I don't know about half the congregation, but it is very expected that when you transition, you will lose at least a couple of people for that reason. And a lot of times I've found that comes from people who are already kind of looking for a spot to leave, or there were other issues usually that are going on. But particularly as my first appointment was me being 23 and a female, and I followed a pastor who was a male who retired. I very much identified with that example of
very different preaching styles.
Very different preaching styles. In my particular case, the church ended up really liking my preaching style, and so it ended up growing a little bit with me coming. Not to like pat myself on the back, but
you're on your high horse right there, real quick, aren't you?
and I mean, it's not a mega church by any means, but I was fortunate enough that they did like me. But I have also seen what happens when people don't give their new pastors a chance. And I think it's kind of funny because this is a very United Methodist problem.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
This is not really that much of a problem outside of the United Methodist Church.
Growing up, you guys both, you grew up in the UMC mostly, right, Andy?
Because my mother is a United Methodist pastor.
Well, I wasn't sure for how long. Yeah. Well, I mean, because
we've had this discussion like what 30 times.
No, I know that. I didn't know
Wait,
at what point in your life that started, or if it was always like that or not. I actually didn't know.
And in his defense, my dad became a UMC pastor when I was in like 4th grade.
Yeah,
so
that's what I was
going
going to follow up with. Was
I didn't grow
I
up
have
in the
been
UMC church.
the entire time I have been alive. Have been
right.
Other than college, I've been a part of the United Methodist Church. There was an extent in high school, and my mother wasn't a pastor, but she was a higher up person than that we didn't call United Methodist Church our home, and that's just because we didn't find one that met our spiritual needs.
Yeah. And even because my personal experience, piggybacking off of Ruth, you saying that it's definitely like a UMC specific problem, or that it happens more with the UMC than other things, because I've only been a part of the United Methodist Church almost in a secondhand way, just because Ruth is a pastor for the UMC. So that would have been for 3-4 years now at most.
Oh gosh, it's been 3.5.
Yeah. So before all that, I grew up, as I'm sure I've said a million times in this podcast already, but non-denominational, basically the same church for the majority of my life, kind of mainly focusing on the Sunday services like in that church, and then as well as the youth programs that they had. But like, I've known that one pastor for my whole life, so I didn't really have experiences with having to compare pastors or having expectations that weren't being met by people that I didn't know, sort of a thing. So that's another reason why, kind of going back, hearing that was a reason that some people didn't want to attend church, that's another reason why it sort of shocked me too, because I never had that experience. Because I don't know how many of our listeners are strictly grew up in the UMC and have dealt with the same thing, and how many of them maybe aren't affiliated with United Methodist Church at all, because I'm wondering how many.
Didn't your parents leave a church because of the pastor?
A multitude of reasons, but I mean, it was one of the reasons, I guess, was that we did end up leaving that church when we were older, but I was still a part of the youth program after my parents after my parents left the church. I was still a part of it.
Sorry, not to like call you out right on there, but
no, that was a good point. Though I didn't even think about
like
that when I was.
Well, and so I much like you, Andy, I come from two sides of this, because I've seen people not give pastors a chance, but I've also seen pastors that don't
take many chances.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I like to I hate to say I like to play both sides on that particular issue, but I think it's worth acknowledging that it was on when I did my research, I compared a couple of different the Pew Research. They're one of the anyhow them
big research people. Yes.
Yep. With them with a couple other websites, and this one showed up in like the top 5 of almost all 3 that I checked, that they didn't trust the pastors. And for me, that was the important distinction. I know I wrote bad pastors, but that was my abbreviation. And I think there's a difference between like bad pastor being, oh, my preference is for a pastor who does this, or no, like I actually genuinely just don't trust pastors. And I think preference is one of the reasons. I mean, we kind of have a church happy environment anyway, where like people tend to be like, oh, I don't like this church, so I don't like what the pastor's saying, so I'm going to hop over here and go to another church, which, I mean, like you just mentioned, it's important to find a place that your spiritual needs are being met. But sometimes that also means being, pushed a little and not always hearing everything you like. And sometimes people don't want that. So yeah, all of this to say it's hard for me in some levels to relate, but at the same time, and naturally I want to come to the pastor's defense, because I was at an appointment, well, not personally, but my father was at an appointment where I watched his self-esteem die in front of my eyes. And I watched an entire congregation of people not care at how they treated him and his family. And I had my little brother ask if Dad was a bad pastor because he overheard people talking about him in the church. And I remember my mom's reaction. She was like, "You're darn lucky it wasn't my daughter who caught you, because she'd have marched you right into his office and said, you better talk to him about this." And it's probably true. I probably would have. And so it's really hard on pastors' families, I think, sometimes, and on when people just have this preference against a pastor when things are a bad fit. But I also think that we can't fully take the accountability off of our pastors either. And that comes from a little bit of my story is that I was very hesitant to become a pastor for a lot of reasons. But the biggest one was that I didn't know if I could handle the responsibility. Because to me, being a pastor is a crap ton of responsibility.
Hmm.
I am responsible for teaching people about who God is. And if I say something wrong, if I'm not on top of it, or if I'm not actively, like, you know, if my relationship with God isn't doing well, that can affect so many more people than just myself.
Mhm.
And that's terrifying. That's terrifying to me, to think that I could be the reason that somebody walked away. And that really turned me away from the ministry for a long time, because I didn't want to do that and be that person in somebody's life. But, you know, when God calls, as much as you might want to ignore it, you still answer. And I started to realize that a lot of my own experience was based in maybe not even necessarily bad pastors, but bad leadership of the church. And that's been something that has been on my heart to work on with the church for a very long time. Again, much like the purpose of this podcast is to delve into these issues. And so setting aside my pride and my ego and my personal stakes in this conversation, I have to admit the church has a horrible history with pastors and with religious leaders. We have a terrible history. And it's not just like, I think the easiest cop-out is to go to the medieval church, because, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that was messed up with the medieval church. But it goes back way further than that. And that even is in Scripture. If we read, who were the people who crucified Jesus? Well, hate to tell you, buddies, but it was the religious leaders.
Yeah.
The chief priests. What are you doing?
What is their name? It starts with a P.
Pharisees.
Pharisees.
Yeah.
The Pharisees
Okay,
and the
sorry.
Sadducees?
Yep, I was losing my mind for a minute there. I apologize.
The same thing happened. You looking at me and asking me is what allowed me to remember it somehow, because I was trying to think of it too. Yeah.
Well, and as much as there are, you know, in Scripture, we also read about great religious figures. Like we read about Moses, we read about David as a key figure who was also kind of messed up.
Yeah.
They're all kind of messed up too, though. But they move forward in their relationship with God, and it's just, it seems like there's something that comes with this idea that people have to, it's like almost a power thing, you know. As much as we try to downplay it, when someone walks into your church, when I preach up front, upstairs, there's one of me preaching to hundreds of other people. That's a position of power, whether or not people want to admit it or not.
Yeah.
That's somebody, that means that my voice in that particular instance is louder than the 200 people in that room.
It's like regardless of intention, it's just the responsibility that's on you, even if you want to feel power or not. I mean, it's just,
Well, and after, again, if we look at Scripture, we see that power really got to a lot of religious leaders' heads at the time. And they were leading the charge. They didn't want to have to change the way they did things. They were very obstinate. And the people that Jesus yells at the most are the religious leaders. So I guess it makes kind of sense that it's a problem that continued. And then we hit, there's a whole bunch of church history I'm skipping over, but then we hit the medieval church and the things that priests were doing, because at the time in the medieval church, the Catholic Church was the predominant one. The Reformation didn't happen until the 1500s. Will you Google me for it?
we talked about the Reformation.
Yeah,
one of
we
our
have.
first
We
episodes.
did. Well, and that's, again, for those of you guys who might not know, the Reformation is when denominations like the United Methodist Church were able to split, not specifically the UMC, but that's when denominations outside of Catholicism began to exist. And Orthodox Church, but that's a whole nother story for another day. Anyhow.
16th century is what I have for the Reformation.
So the 1500s.
Protestant. Yeah. Yep. That's
nice.
I always hate how that math works out. Sorry, that's
the
a side rant.
16th century
That's the
versus
16th
it takes me
century is the 1500s.
It takes me like a full, at least a full
It's
second to
speaking
remember
about
every time.
like the time period that happened before it, which is dumb.
But the church at the time, and we talked a little bit about this with our D&D conversation, had so much power. So much power. I mean, they did, for those of you guys who've heard of, the Holy Wars,
Oh,
they were
goodness.
able to lead. I mean, but those were led by religious leaders.
Yeah.
And for some reason, why is the name of those escaping?
Crusade.
The Crusades. Thank you. I'm like, I
Yeah.
can't think of that word. The
Elijah,
Crusades.
you're just on the word game today.
You are.
Yeah, I'm 2 for 2. Yeah.
And that's a part.
I'm on it.
Well, and the Crusades are something that Christians are super uncomfortable talking about. But that was religious leaders charging people into literal battle for them. You have priests at the time, and again, I do have to clarify this is the Catholic Church of the time, would like just have children with whoever they wanted, put them in positions of power, and then they'd become priests. And so like priests, it became this ridiculous power structure where all of these people would be intertwined, and you couldn't even hear scripture in your own language because they didn't trust you to understand it.
Jeez. Yeah.
Like literally, that was it. You need to trust us. We're going to speak it in Latin, and you need to trust us that we're telling you the proper interpretation.
More than just a few bad apples in the church. It
Yeah,
was,
the
it was
whole
completely
structure.
different. It was a different world.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's whenever you have any kind of structure that can power corrupts. I mean,
Mhm.
it happens, and so I don't think that this is a unique problem just to the church, but it's harder for us to acknowledge it because we want to think of the church as being this pure, holy place where these things are vetted. But that's not always the case. I mean, how many times in our lifetime have you heard of huge pastor church scandals?
Yeah.
Far too often.
Far too often.
Too often.
And those are only the big churches we hear about.
Mhm.
We don't hear about the smaller churches and what happens there.
Yeah. Right.
And, the track record's not exactly great.
Nope.
But we still find ourselves in this place where I think, and it's not, I don't feel like pastors assume, some do, assume that they have the trust and deserve it. But maybe we're not fully aware of the fact that, again, one of the top reasons people don't want to come to church is because they don't trust pastors.
Talking about all these examples definitely makes it easier for someone like me to put myself in another person's shoes and sort of understand why they might not trust a pastor then. Because I had remembering having to remind myself that my idea of a pastor is solely based on my experience, which overall was a really good upbringing. But when you look at all these examples, real examples throughout history, including right now, like especially like you said, a lot of scandals that happen with a lot of bigger names that most normal people, whether they're involved with the church or not, like hear about. It definitely seems a lot more obvious why some people just as a default probably wouldn't put too much trust in any pastor.
Well, and-
I can't really blame everyone for it.
Well, and the problem is the churches sweep it under the rug.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of instances that I've seen in these scandals where, for instance, a lot of the ones that have to do with sexual abuse, where they will say, we reported this, and they told us it was handled, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
And then the pastor just gets transferred elsewhere, or
And that's all that
different
happens.
things, and that's,
right.
that's like one of the larger scandalous kind of things that we see in our generation.
It's such a large scandal that like
Absolutely.
Christians don't even realize that it is a scandal sometimes.
Well, and us
'cause
Protestants want to pretend like that's only in the Catholic Church, and
Yeah.
it is not.
yeah.
It is not. And then, or like for these mega church pastors who it happens to, they come out with one apology and everyone's just supposed to hug and embrace them again and move on.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's kind of terrifying. I wouldn't, and imagine if you know somebody who's been through that. And on top of just those scandals, there's the scandals with money laundering. We see that one of the biggest growing churches in the world is the Prosperity Church, the Prosperity Gospel, which essentially tells you that as long as you are a good Christian, you will be blessed with material things from God. So as long as you're good enough, God will give you that $1 million.
And Ruth,
So-
what qualifies as being good enough?
Whatever the pastor says. Literally. Whatever it depends on.
Yeah.
No, it does. It depends on who it is. And usually
There's really never
usually
one
it's
straight
just-
answer. is
No,
there?
there's not. Well,
There's
because-
always a central theme, but never the same answer.
Well, ultimately, it's because then they can answer when somebody comes to them and says, "Why did my friend die of cancer?"
yeah.
Didn't have enough faith, and it's all on them.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible. But those are the things that those leaders and those are people in the church that people look up to, and there are a lot of Christians who still follow a lot of active church leaders who have come through these scandals.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of them know and some of them don't.
Yeah.
And then we find other examples of Christian leadership, again, not necessarily just pastors, but one really big one comes from the Christian singer Amy Grant. She was a really popular Christian singer, and then she got a divorce, and she was axed from every Christian station. Just absolutely no one would play her music. They refused because how
Wow.
dare she? She didn't get or she got a divorce. And then it came out that her husband had been cheating on her. And all of a sudden the Christian music industry came flooding back like, "Oh, we can accept you now."
Mm-hmm.
What? We didn't realize that it actually wasn't your fault. It's fine now.
Yeah. Do you know how
Like-
long it took for them?
It was a while.
Yeah.
It was a while. Which
Not that it would
she shouldn't
make
have-
any difference.
Well, and she
but
shouldn't have had to come out with that to be accepted.
No,
That's the
exactly.
and when this is the leadership structure, because even though it specifically says not trusting pastors, I have to think that part of that is not trusting the structure.
Yeah.
And
Well, because pastors are I mean, they're the face of leadership in the church, whether they want to be or not. They just, yeah.
well, and I mean, how many times, Elijah, from our group of friends that we have who are non-Christian, have we heard embezzlement jokes?
Yeah.
And it's not; those are not offensive in any. I'm not like, "Oh, how dare my friends joke about this?" But
Opposite, actually.
but like, it's something that people who aren't actively involved in the church make jokes about because it's so prominently known.
Joke about reality. Yeah. It's because it's easy to draw examples from.
Exactly.
It doesn't take a lot of research to find examples of those things. And you know.
Well, I was waiting
A
for
little
you
bit
to
of dead air. Yeah.
keep it.
I didn't know where to go. I couldn't come up with a comment. And
You were commentless this time.
at least for the part about embezzlement, that's just not something that I think about when I think about this whole idea of not trusting your pastor and all this kind of stuff. Because there's a lot of, I guess, when I think more of this idea of not trusting your pastor, I always side with the pastor, because I always think that, oh, if you don't trust your pastor, then there has to be an example that's come from somebody who's not your pastor. And I guess it's kind of like a me thing, but I know that I've heard examples of trustees, and no offense to anybody, because I assume you're not these kind of people, that are like, they withheld money from their pastor because the pastor wasn't preaching in the style that they wanted them to preach in.
Yeah.
And that leads to the pastor just being not in the right mindset always to preach and all this kind of stuff. And so, especially in pastor scenarios, my blame doesn't fall to the pastor all the time.
I think,
Well, and it shouldn't all the time.
Yeah.
I don't
No,
think.
yeah.
But
and I don't even think we're necessarily talking about, we have talked a lot about certain examples where blame should be placed, but at the end of the day, what we're really actually focusing on is just the fact that a pretty large amount of people simply don't trust their pastors, regardless of who's actually at fault, and regardless of their personal experiences or maybe just their outside view. But I think what we can all agree on is that, in general, I would claim that pastors are usually like the face of leadership, And through all these examples that people know about, even if they haven't experienced it personally, there's a lot of examples that people have been exposed to that would make them question leadership in the church, regardless if it's actually, if some of these more personal examples are actually the fault of pastors who are not trained properly, or pastors who are power hungry, or something else completely where the pastor's not at fault at all and it's a misunderstanding. Like, regardless, there's a lot of examples that people know about that would make them, that clearly make them weary when they think about, joining a church, regardless of who's actually at fault in those examples.
All right. Well, yeah, we are running out of time today, and I don't know if you guys have any closing comments or anything like that.
I don't know. I don't really know how to close it out. I think that in regardless of whatever your reason for enjoying or not wanting to go to church is, I had something for that night. Now I don't know where I'm going with it. I was gonna say something just along the lines of there are people in anything, including the church, that are in it, to put it blatantly, for power.
Yeah.
And there's people in the leadership of church who are trying their darn best and might not be doing the job that you want, or maybe, or I don't know. Everyone in the church is a human being.
Yes.
And you can look at examples, good and bad, and make objective statements about them. And I think it's important to be objective in like examining a lot of those. But in your own personal life, just remember that whether you're thinking of people who are part of the congregation or you're thinking about people in leadership, that everyone there is a human being, and everyone there is probably trying their hardest to be a good person. That's how I like to at least approach examples, before diving too deep into it. And I hope that that's the truth in most cases.
Well, next episode, we're going to dive a little bit more into that, into how can pastors rebuild some trust, maybe, and how can we acknowledge the fact that there are bad pastors out there who have lost trust, and how you shouldn't feel wrong for seeing those examples and being disheartened by the church. And because I don't want to shame anyone for that, because that is a very real thing that happens. But also acknowledging and moving forward, as we talked about last week in our trauma episode. And so those are my closing thoughts, and give us a listen next week, or it's Thursday. It's Thursday.
Thursday's our next episode.
Yep.
So I thank you all for tuning in today. If you have made it this far into the episode, let us know if you agree and disagree with any of our comments. Let us know other examples that you have, and you don't have to provide names at all if you don't want to. Actually, please don't use names. We don't need names.
I was going to say, maybe not names.
We don't need to call people out.
Hey, we appreciate all of you.
Yeah, we appreciate all of you for tuning in and listening. If you're interested in finding us more about us, we have our Facebook page, our Instagram. Please leave us a comment, suggestions that you have, or ideas of people that you want to see on the show. That being said, for all of us here at Church is Stupid,
Comma but.
I'm Andy.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
Have a great week.